Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all are doing well. Welcome to JS Core. Live हो गया? Just give me a second. Yeah, fine. Okay, fine. So, again, once again, good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to JS Core. So, I hope you all know me. My name is Piyush, right? And today, as you all know, that we are going to have a session basically on the that could be called as the first lecture, basically of history optional, right? But then I am calling it the orientation session, and there is a reason behind it. Why? Because of what I have been calling it an orientation session, right? And I would like to discuss everything with respect to the subject, but yes, many of you may not find it as a sort of many of you may not find it which is directly, or like this particular session is directly related to history. So maybe many of you realizing that it is something which is beyond your syllabus or content. That is incorrect. Everything what I'm going to discuss is having certain utility. That's the reason because of what I am preferring, or I am having this particular discussion. Fine. So basically, there is a, I would like to start this particular session with a general question, right? The question is very simple, because the moment it comes to history optional, right? So there is a term which is associated with it, that is optional, right? It is not history as a discipline, rather it is history as an optional paper. So when you have been writing this examination of UPSC Civil Services, at that point of time you need to opt one optional paper, and you are having choices. Out of these choices you need to select one optional paper, and that optional plays somehow very important role in your selection, and not only in your selection, rather I can say even in the rank decision, right? Because if you score somewhere close to 300, or let's say 280 290, in that case you are in a condition to secure a very good rank. But if you're not able to score this much, let's say you have been scoring 250, so 260, in that case we are able to somehow clear this examination, but ultimately the rank is suffering, right? You are not able to secure a very good rank. And in fact, I know many of the students this year, they cleared this examination, and they managed to score very good rank only because of the optional paper, right? One of my student, Aditi Dubey, got cleared. She has scored 280 marks in history optional, and the way she scored 280, and she believes that it is just because of the optional, that she secured 180 rank. Otherwise it would have become quite tough for her, right? So optional does play very important. So why am I saying this? This logic is very simple, because when it comes to choosing the optional and then further preparing this optional, there it is very important that you prepare the optional in such a way that ultimately you are scoring close to 300, that not only you are getting selected, but at the same time you are at the same time you are securing a good rank. Both the things are very important. So when you opt for history as a discipline in your universities, right, or in your academics, at that point of time the the approach is very different. But when you have been opting for history optional, in that case your approach should be very different. That is what is the main concern what we are going to discuss in today's session. So when it comes to history optional, as you can see that at one hand there are some people they are able to cross 300 also, or they are somehow reaching to very close to, they are reaching close to 300. On the other hand, you find certain students, those who are not even able to manage more than 200 scores also. There are so many students who's those who are falling shorter, and in fact we can say they are getting or scoring lesser than they are scoring lesser than 200 marks. So you understand that ultimately they have been failing just because of this. But the main point what I'm willing to discuss here, what do you think that when it comes to those who have been managing, or those who have managed to score somewhere around 300, are they very different from you, right? Are these scholars of the subject? But if you have been talking about a student who scored 300, and you believe that that fellow has done PhD in history, and that's how he or she managed to score 300 or close to 300, but since we haven't done PhD in history, and that's why we cannot score this much. Frankly speaking, what I'm saying, that is completely incorrect. Those who are managing to score 300 or close to 300, even they are also the simple students, right? They may be the only USP what I have seen with those students, that they might have done some sort of graduation or post graduation. It is not necessary. What I'm saying, they might have done. It is not something a sort of necessary condition, but a max to max, what USPs or what advantages they had. So there we can talk about that they have done these kind of things. Maximum. This is what can happen. But then nobody, or you are not competing with anybody who has done PhD. In that case, what is or how come it is possible that these people are able to score such a good marks? On the other hand, others have been facing problems, or they have been facing difficulties in scoring this much. Can you say that these people were recommending, or these people were referring several material, right? So they have been reading let's say 10 books in ancient, 10 books in medieval, 10 in modern, 10 in world. They have been reading so many books. And since they have read so many 40, 50 books on the history optional paper, and that's the reason because of what they secured such a good mark. I think again this is also a sort of misnomer or the rumor. I don't need to tell you, but then you all know, or you must have seen the videos of all those toppers, and they are always saying one thing: okay, stick to the minimal sources, right? Everybody is saying the same thing: stick to the minimal sources, right? So nobody is ever recommending that no, you have to at least read 5 books in each section, then only you'll be able to score very good. Nobody is saying like this. So if they are reading the same sources, right, and in fact these sources are not very peculiar. ऐसा नहीं है कि ये sources आपको नहीं पता है और उनको पता है. When it comes to ancient India, everybody knows of Upinder Singh's book. When it comes to medieval India, you know that Satish Chandra is a very popular book. Everybody reads that particular book. For modern, Sekhar Bandapradhyay's book, from Palasi to Partition and After, कोई बहुत नई किताब नहीं है. Since 1 decade, people have been referring this particular book. So what I'm willing to say, that people have been going for people are referring the same sort of source material. Then the real question comes in: if it is so, in that case, how come it is possible that there are many people, they are not able to score even after referring the same sort of material, but then others are able to score such a good number just by referring the same sort of material? There comes the question, there lies the question. And you have to think, you have to somehow you have to somehow somehow do some sort of some sort of brainstorming, that what is the difference between the two, because of what one is able to achieve good marks, one is not. So that is the main question, what we are going to discuss in today's session. Fine. So basically the way I'm telling you, that if the people are there, those who are not able to score very good, in that case I can say just a second. Okay, fine. So I believe that those who are not able to score very good, they are having certain problems, right? Or basically there are some basic fundamental reasons are there, because of what others are not able to score very good, but some are managing good score, right? So first of all, I would like to say that if I'll talk about the differences. So when it comes to the basic, right, fundamental understanding, the basic fundamental understanding of the subject, right? Now, why am I saying a basic fundamental understanding? Am I willing to say that uh, those who have studied history for some other sources, they are not having the basic fundamental understanding to a certain extent? Yes, this is what I have been willing to say. That basic fundamental understanding is very important, but then unfortunately, you guys do not follow it, right? Whenever you decide to go for history optional, what is the basic tendency or the approach what students follow? The basic approach is either they are supposed to pick up some notes, that is one thing, or else they were supposed to join certain coaching, and then they believe that this is the content, right? And the content they also study in a very point format. I have seen that sometimes PPT based learning is there. If PPT, you have been going for the PPT based learning, for what PPT is very good, PPT is good when you have been presenting the things in a very point format. Let's say you have been picking up just one topic, there are 10 points in it, and then you have been presenting all those 10 points, it is good. But then when the things are quite conceptual, at that point of time, you cannot follow these kind of learning pattern, the PPT based learning pattern, because PPTs, as I told you, that it is somehow confining you to all those points which are written in the PPTs. But then the subject of history is not something which can be confined, or which should be confined within certain points. But then unfortunately you all have been following the same pattern. And frankly speaking, the kind of questions which are coming these days, and specifically I'll talk about these questions in ancient and modern Indian history. Now these questions are highly conceptual. Now they cannot be covered only through the PPTs, right? And then what do they do? Basically, the way I did tell you, that while referring these content, ultimately you focus on certain points, and that's how you understand history with respect to these points only. So don't try to understand the history with respect to the points, because if you have seen the paper of 2024, in that case you have to admit this point, that ultimately the questions were very conceptual being asked, except one or two questions. So until and unless you are understanding, your concepts are very sound, frankly speaking, you won't be able to answer very good. Maybe many of you must be still thinking you have attempted that paper of 2024, and you are in a condition to write you are in a position to write very good answer of those questions. Frankly speaking, I'm not convinced with this idea, right? कि those answers were very good. अगर answers अच्छे होते तो आपको marks भी अच्छे आते, पर अगर marks अच्छे नहीं आए, इसका मतलब है कि there are certain problems, right? So this is one thing I'll say, that while reading, while preparing for this particular subject, always try to develop certain conceptual clarity, certain certain theoretical understanding of the subject, rather than this is one aspect, and in this particular aspect 10 points are there, next next aspect 10 pointers are there. So leave this point format preparation, because until and unless you leave this system of studying the subject with respect to the point, frankly speaking, your score won't be very good, right? So focus on the conceptual understanding. Now the second point, I would like to discuss, that is about basically the random preparation, right? Now also I'll tell you that what is this random preparation. Random preparation, right? Now what is this random preparation? Now the moment you think for history optional, what do? You start reading randomly anything, right? So somebody has recommended one book, you started reading that. And in fact, I have noticed couple of students, they have been reading the subject, sometimes they have been reading ancient, they jump to the medieval, sometimes from medieval they jump to the modern, and sometimes they have been reading all the papers, four papers together. As far as this world is concerned, that is one part which is slightly different, and in fact that is one part that could be either covered simultaneously, that one possibility is there, or else we can say you can cover it in the beginning, that is fair enough, right? But then while approaching to ancient, medieval and modern, these three sections of Indian history, which are the prime, which is somehow 75% of your syllabus, if you have been going for if you have been going for if you're not following a chronological approach to understand this ancient, medieval and modern, frankly it is not good for you, right? अगर आप कहीं से भी शुरू हो रहे हैं, ठीक है, randomly you have been reading anything, लेकिन अभी आप एंशियंट पढ़ रहे थे, फिर आप medieval पढ़ने लगे, medieval से फिर आप मॉडर्न में चले गए, अगर आप ऐसे रैंडम शिफ्ट करेंगे, तो जो मैं अंडरस्टैंडिंग की बात कर रहा हूँ, what understanding I have been talking about, frankly speaking you won't be able to develop any understanding, because ultimately you need to somehow fix it in your mind that history is should be always history should be studied chronologically, because ultimately when you enter into the next period, right? So in what happens, you in that case you are in a position to compare it with the previous period, and then you understand ki, okay, in the last stage the society were having these phenomena or the features, and in this particular stage the society is having this phenomena and feature. So this is how you can talk about, or you can understand the history with respect to this continuity and change. That is what I have been trying to tell, trying to tell you. So don't read the subject randomly. This is one mistake which is being done by certain students. Point number 3, that is the great dependence on notes. Many students, those who are enlightened enough, they also believe that notes are sufficient to cater their requirement. Now, I always used to say notes can never cater your requirement. And mind you, for that matter, any kind of notes that you have been referring, they cannot cater all of your requirement. For that matter, even I'll say that if you're saying, if you'll be asking this question to me, that if you have been buying my notes and or you got access to my notes, is it possible to prepare like the optional paper with the help of these notes? Like no, there is no such notes in the market which can cater all of your requirement. The point is that whatsoever I had been discussing just now, if we'll try to understand that only with respect to what point I have been discussing right now, frankly speaking, it is impossible to cover the syllabus with the notes. Notes are always something which is giving you the things in a very crisp manner, right? And the notes could never develop a sort of conceptual clarity of any particular topic in you. That is how any notes cannot be a permanent solution. But then this is a sort of preconceived notion among many students that we don't need any guidance, any mentorship, or most importantly the reading of any book, right? They can simply cover the syllabus with the help of notes. Why? Because in the notes all those topics have been given which are there in the UPSC. So if the questions are being asked in the same way, in that case it is okay, fine, you can do it. But then if the questions are not being asked in this way, in that case you can't consult the notes, or you can't be over dependent on the notes. So if you have been willing to prepare the optional paper by your own, in that case at least this is my urge, my request to you, that develop the habit of reading the books, because the books are never being written in the same fashion the way it's being written in the notes. What happens when you are consulting the notes, or else I can say, after reading the books maybe you are relying on the notes, that is okay, or you are making your own notes, that is also okay. But then in the beginning you read the notes. If you have been doing it by your own, it is very important, or it's, let's say, it is must, I must say. And the last point, or the fourth point, I'll say that these days I have noticed that people have started becoming more and more dependent on the PYQs. I don't know from where this particular notion has developed, that cover the PYQs will cover the your optional will be done. Very recently, maybe 3 or 4 days back, I just met with one of the students. He was willing to take history as an optional paper, but then his query was this: is, sir, I'm a working professional and that is why I do not have much time, or I'm having some sort of time crisis. So in that case I won't be able to attend any coaching or something like that. So I simply want to follow a simple pattern for it. And what is it? I'll cover the PYQs. And as you all know that my PYQs are the answers of last 15 years PYQs. That's very much appreciated by the students. So he was willing to only buy that. So he said, I'll prepare the whole syllabus with respect to notes. Maybe this particular idea must be working few years back. ठीक है, अगर आप 2020 से पहले की बात करेंगे तो मैं कह सकता हूँ कि ठीक है, ये सारी चीजें काम करती थी. बट पिछले एक डिकेड में मुझे लगता है कि UPSC specifically with respect to history optional had started doing several sort of innovations, right? बहुत सारे innovations जो है उन लोगों ने शुरू किए हैं. And in fact, frankly speaking, I do not find that the questions coming from various themes. Mind you, what I'm telling you, the themes are being repeated, and of course the themes would be repeated, na? Of history, as while making the questions, the people won't get it from any third source or any third sort of thing. Ultimately they have to refer the syllabus. There are certain topics given in the syllabus, but then it depends on what dimension is being asked. So I have seen, what I have noticed, of course, I cannot say that all the questions are like this, but then majority of the questions are based on the same themes, but they have been asking for a new dimension. Now you believe that you have studied the history of Palasi, right? Or let's say history of Battle of Palasi. And since you have studied Battle of Palasi, that's why you'll be able to answer the question. The point is that whether are you in a condition to answer exactly what has been asked in the question. And frankly, I believe that if you you'll be dependent so much on the PYQs, in that case you will keep on facing the difficulties, right? So I don't believe that this is a right perception or the right notion that is there among the students. So if you'll ask me that what is the reason because of what some are able to score very good and some are not, these are the 4 points I realized. These are the things because of what, at one hand there are certain which are capable of understanding it in a pretty good way. On the other hand, the others are facing difficulties. Fine. So moral of the story is this: so the moment it comes to for that matter any optional paper, and precisely since I teach history optional paper, so I'll be talking about history optional paper. So you have to develop a sort of sort of basically a very good amount of understanding, right? So understanding or the conceptual clarity is very important, and that's why I would like to start from this point only, right? Conceptual clarity. Now, you may ask this question that why is this conceptual clarity needed? हम नहीं जाएंगे, हमें नहीं समझना है, हमें हिस्ट्री जो है पॉइंट फॉर्मेट में ही समझना है कि हाँ भाई इतने पॉइंट्स हैं, हमें हर चीज के लिए पॉइंट्स चाहिए. Point format में even like writing answer is also not a very good idea. But yet like if you wish to understand history with respect to the points, fair enough, that is your choice, there's no problem. But then I believe that when it comes to the history, a sort of basic understanding is very much important. Okay. Now, why is this basic understanding is important? Because whatsoever disciplines are there which are being taught in the universities, frankly speaking, if we'll talk about these disciplines, so there is a context of it, right? So you must admit that there is a context under which these disciplines are being being taught in the universities, and this context is the reason, primary reason, because of what the meanings of the subject is changing. Fine. Such as I think it's better to understand this particular point with respect to certain examples, such as I'll be giving you certain very simple examples to make you understand it. Let's say, what is the context? Let's say there is one topic that you have been studying, caste. Now caste you understand in history also, caste you understand in geography also, this you understand in, sorry, not geography, in society also, in political science also. Like there are numbers of subjects or the discipline in which you will study this particular topic, caste. But then if I'll be asking that is it correct to say that the same sort of treatment is needed to this question of caste while writing the answer in every discipline? In that case, if you do not agree with me, then it is okay. But I believe that no, the approach would be very different while answering this particular question based on caste, right? In the same way, acha, we can talk a little bit more about it. So when you have been dealing with the caste question in history, right? Sorry, in sociology. So basically, it is one of the existing notion with respect to the modern society, and how the caste is becoming one of the very important criteria for dividing the society or for creating a hierarchy in the society or the stratification in the society. So as far as this caste and stratification of society is concerned, that is there even in the history part also. But the evolution becomes the most important question. So here you simply talk about the stratification in sociology, right? But if you have been studying caste in history, in that case you have to understand basically that what are the right reasons for this evolution of caste, and then what are or how it had been creating that stratification in the society. So that question is changing in history, and the question and approach is changing in sociology, right? In the same way, let us pick up another topic, such as if you have been taking the topic of urbanization. Now, urbanization you even study in geography, urbanization you even study in history. Now, if you have been dealing with the same topic in both the different discipline, in that case, if you believe that the approach should be very similar, in that case, it is incorrect, right? Another example we can say, let's say you have been talking about state. Now, state you discuss even in political science and public administration, but if the same state is being discussed by you in basically basically history, in that case again the question and the approach would be very different. So while talking about while talking about the state, you need to discuss basically about the evolution of the state, right? And what are the basic prerequisites for the development of the state, and these are the points which are more important for you with respect to history. But when you have been dealing with the same sort of question in polity and then public administration, in that case the approach would be very different. So why is understanding very important? This is the reason, because of what understanding is very important, right? Now the point is that okay, fine, we can talk about understanding. What sort of understanding I have been trying to discuss? So of course in this particular session we cannot talk about everything so one by one we are going to start the things. While covering the courses, of course I'll be dealing with several other aspects. So when it comes to understanding, there is a very basic question, and this question is right. This question is that can somehow develop the basic understanding in you, that there is one word which is called as history, and there is another word that is called as past. So these are two words you should be very clear of while beginning the preparation for history optional. ये दो सवाल हैं जो बहुत अहम हैं. आपको शुरू में ही इसके बारे में क्लैरिटी चाहिए. You should be very clear about this particular. ये what happens, both the terms seems to be quite synonym, right? So they seems to be quite identical. कि एक ही तो है पास्ट और हिस्ट्री में क्या फर्क है, दोनों एक ही है, हिस्ट्री मतलब पास्ट, पास्ट मतलब हिस्ट्री. So you know majority of you are having this particular approach. No, frankly speaking, they seem to be different, but only once you see it in intellectual or methodological terms. In that case, you can find the basic fundamental differences between past and history, right? What is past, so when it comes to the past, and in fact majority of the scholars have discussed this particular part, right? So if we'll talk about, if we'll talk about past, then you need to keep in mind certain things in your mind. Past is something which can be called as fixed, right? And then we can also say ki the exactly the way the things have happened, that is past, right? But when it comes to history, that is precisely speaking, that is selective, that is that is interpretive, and we can even call history as constructive, right? So the way I have been telling you, that past is something which is fixed, exactly how the things have happened. But the moment it comes to history, right, when it comes to exact history, so frankly speaking, what are the terms that I did tell you? That history is something which is selective, right? Which is selective. Then I can say it is constructive. So these are certain terms, that you should keep in mind. And in fact, was one more term we can add. It is interpretive. So understand this, a basic difference between these two. As I told you, that what is past? Past is fixed. So it has happened, right? Whether you know or you do not know, that is subjective. And I am not willing to discuss also this point. And in why? Because it is not very important. In fact, there's one very popular scholar, that's called as David Lowenthal, right? He simply gave this statement that the past is everything that have happened, that have that even happened. Whether history is what historians write about the past. Now this is a very precise definition of it, that past that has happened. But whether what is history, what is being when history is being, or sorry, past is being interpreted by the historians, that becomes the past. So there is a basic difference between the two, word. Apart from that, also we can say when it comes to history, that we can say, we can understand with respect to one of the greatest scholars, E.H. Carr. So E.H. Carr is simply saying that history is basically an unending dialogue between the present and the past. Why? Because the historians, those who have been writing about the past, they are continuously having interaction with the sources and the other things of the past, and on the basis of they have in that they have been creating. But this is also very subjective. Why? Because this particular notion does not remain same, rather it has been going through, matlab, that understanding of the people, that those who are called as historians, it had been going through a sort of perpetual change. It is going through a sort of a process of the change, and that's how it is an unending dialogue between past and the present. So the past is being being reflected by the various sources, and the present is being reflected by the historians. And when these two are meeting, ultimately history is being created. And that is how history is also not something which is fixed, or history is something which is unchanging. Rather, we can say history is a discipline which is continuously changing, and you are the victim of that one, right? Why you people are able to score very good? Because you are not able to you are not able to somehow understand how it is changing. That is one important reason. Anyways, so when it comes to the past, that there's also one thing, past is not recorded. That is true. Like everything that has happened in in past, so they are part of past. But then of course everything that has happened in past, it's not recorded. On the other hand, when it comes to the history which is based on the sources, now sources, since they are fragmented, they are biased, they are incomplete, and that's how the history what we write on the basis of these kind of sources, they are always sort of incomplete. So nobody can ever claim that they have been writing a complete history. That is the reason sorry, that is the reason because of what historians never get into this particular debate ki the past is exactly or past is identical to history. There is no question in that, right? And in fact, on the basis of this particular idea only, you can find that three different schools are based. Like anyways, you don't need to remember all these kind of things जो हम बात कर रहे हैं. ऐसा नहीं कि आपको बहुत बेहतर समझ चाहिए, आपको बहुत कुछ पढ़ना है इसके बारे में. It's not needed. But then please fix these ideas in your mind. that you can ultimately use them while understanding the subject. So basically there was one school that's called as the positivist school, right? There was one school that's called as positivist school, and this school was being represented by, or one of the greatest scholar of this is was Ranke. When it comes to Ranke, he simply says, or he believed that historians can reconstruct the past exactly how it has happened, right? Now, this is very subjective. Please note it down. Ranke is one of the leading scholar of history who is contributing for deciding that how exactly, or what is the exact nature of the subject. And we'll talk about him after some time once again also. So he says it is possible for the historians to record the history or record the past exactly how it has happened, right? So this is the basic idea. But on the other hand, if we'll talk about another school that's called as the postmodernist school, right? I emphasize a lot while teaching this postmodernist school. Now this postmodernist school is having an altogether different idea. First of all, let me tell you that who all are there. Okay, those who had been representing it. So there are two very important scholars. Probably you might have heard the name of this. That's called as Hayden White and Michael Foucault, right? So Hayden White and Michael Foucault, these two are representing this. And in fact, they argue that history is a narrative constructed, and it can, mind you what I'm telling you, that history is a narrative. The moment I'm saying narrative, it means that it is a sort of created one. Past is something which is fixed. So the positivists believe that actually it is possible for the historians to create it in the same fashion. But the era in which we are living right now, that is the era postmodernism. And in fact, the postmodernism is coming to Europe slightly early, at least 5 decades early. But then you can find that the greatest impact of postmodernism is there in the current scenario, or in the current history writing. And as I told you that Hayden White and Michael Foucault, these kind of postmodernists believe that history is a narrative which is constructed, right? So it is, they are not claiming it is the past which is constructed. It is a narrative, and narrative is something which can be built, right? Narrative is something which can be changed. So probably what ideas you are having, that was your narrative. But then maybe you got into some sort of reading and some sort of you attended a lecture, and after that it is quite possible that your narratives are changing. So that is what they have been saying. And in fact, they refuse this idea that history is basically the mirror, right, of the past. They even refuse this, right? That is a very important idea. And the way I did tell you that postmodernism is that idea which is largely controlling the direction of the history in the present day, or in the contemporary times. That is why it is very important. And then finally it comes to in another school that has their own idea, that's called a subaltern school. Now, what is this subaltern school? That is being represented in European context by Antonio Gramsci, and then it comes to India. Ranajit Guha is the person who is representing it. So when it comes to their understanding, so basically for them, it is very important, or in fact they question that it is very important to understand that whose past is being written. So maybe you are aware of the subaltern. If you're not aware of the subaltern, we'll have a sort of a longer discussion on subaltern. Right now, I'm simply telling you that this question for them is very important, that whose history is being written. And in fact, they believe that while writing the history, majority of the historians have been leaving, or they have been excluding the larger section of Indian society, what they call as subaltern, and that is how they are coming up with this idea. So what they are saying, actually it is not past, because it is very subjective that whose history is being written. So that's when it comes to the connection between past and the history. As I told you that majority of the scholars are not convinced with this idea that past and history is equally same, except the positivist, right? Positivist बहुत पहले आते थे. That is they were there in the 19th century, right? So if you believe, or if you follow this perception that history is merely the past, then please come out of it. These two things are very different. There's by any chance it cannot be called as identical. So there are great differences between the two, right? So history is basically a narrative which is being built, which is being created by the historian. And in fact, this is also one point that you should understand. As far as the understanding of the subject itself is concerned, right? So the understanding of the subject, understanding of history is concerned, as I told you that in 20th century, one of the leading scholar of history, that's called as E.H. Carr, is categorically saying it is an unending process of dialogue or unending dialogue between past and present. It means that it is changing. It is perpetually changing. So that is why I would like to throw some light basically on this idea that how come this perception of history is something which is changing, right? So we will try to understand it from from the from the ancient times, that you can somehow correlate, or you can understand what is, or how the idea of history is changing, and how the new perceptions are coming. And in fact, I'll start it from the ancient times and I'll come to the 20th century, in fact like 21st century, and I'll say that how the how this particular narrative has changed altogether, and a new concept or the new perception is there for the history. Fine. So let us start with the ancient times. Fine. So again, I'll say it is not something which is very important कि आपको ये सब याद रखना है, आपको कुछ भी याद नहीं रखना है, बस मेरी बात आप सुनिए और थोड़ा समझने की कोशिश करिए. मैं बार बार एक ही चीज कहता हूँ कि हिस्ट्री इज ऑल अबाउट अंडरस्टैंडिंग, राइट? इट इज नॉट अबाउट मगिंग अप द फैक्ट्स. ये सब बातें हम नहीं करेंगे अभी कि हिस्ट्री जो है सिर्फ फैक्ट्स होता है, और व्हाट आर द र्यूमर्स अराउंड द फैक्ट्स. ठीक है, वो आपने बहुत सारा कुछ देखा है उसके ऊपर, यू नो सो मेनी थिंग्स. शायद आप मुझसे भी ज़्यादा जानते होंगे कि हिस्ट्री में कितना फैक्ट्स है, कितने अंडरस्टैंडिंग है, हिस्ट्री में जो है कितने स्कोर्स आते हैं, हिस्ट्री कितने वास्ट है या नहीं है. तो ये बहुत आइडिया है. हिस्ट्री का जीएस के साथ कितना ओवरलैपिंग है, ये सब आपको पता है. ठीक है, हम वी आर नॉट गोइंग टू डिस्कस दोस काइंड. फाइन. So what is this ancient understanding of ancient understanding of past? Sorry, history, not past. So you know that who is called as the father of Indian history? The person who has been called as the father of Indian history is the, sorry, not Indian history, history is called as Herodotus, right? So Herodotus, as one of the Greek fellow, known as the father of history. Now this person defined the history in this way: कि history is a necessary discipline in order to preserve the past, right, or some of the important events of past, in order to make the future generations aware of it. Again, I have been repeating, what does it what does he say? He says ki whatsoever is happening either in past, or let's say in whatsoever important events are happening either in past or in the contemporary times. Specifically, he talks about the contemporary times. Everything should be recorded, right? Why was why this should be recorded? Because it is very important for us, or it is a sort of important duty for us to record all those kind of things, that we can literally make them aware to the future generations, right? That is the idea what they have been saying, right? So that was the definition of that was the definition which was given by this fellow Herodotus, right? There was one more fellow, okay, that was called as Confucius, right? So Confucius, he was from China. Now he says that history should be studied in order to understand the development of the moral order. So for him, history is a discipline which is more connected to the morality. Why morality? Because if we have to understand the society or the history of the various societies, in that case, morality is one thing which is the most important content of history, and that should be understood with respect to this. So these two scholars have been defining history, and in fact both of them were more or less in the same 6th and 5th century BC, and they had been defining the history in this particular way. But then you must be agreeing on this particular point, that this is the idea of history what is not being followed by us in the current time. Rather, we have deviated a lot from this part. So we will discuss how it is gradually happening, right? So this is the understanding which was given by them. Now you might have seen there were so many questions were being asked on two terms in ancient Indian history. In fact, one is Purana, Itihasa Purana, right? And the second is the Kalhanas Raj Tarangini. Kalhanas Raj Tarangini. There are two terms which have been very frequently being asked in question paper to you by the people, or in the UPSC history optional questions. Now, why is these two questions very important? Because frankly speaking, when you talk about Puranas as history, or let's say Itihasas as history, or the epics as history, or else you talk about let's say let's say Kalhanas Raj Tarangini as history. So they should be evaluated on the basis of the early notion for history, rather than you should not be allowed to understand or interpret history or interpret like basically these texts what I have been discussing that right now as history books with respect to the modern understanding of history. दोनों बिल्कुल अलग है. तो इसीलिए while like answering these kind of questions, like this is one thing that you should keep in mind. So in the ancient times, somehow like this remained the basic understanding of history, and this is the reason because of what like mostly they have been like understand they have been recording what sort of event they had been recording, some of the important like that is one thing important, but the most important thing they were recording mostly the political events, because at that point of time somehow they believe that the political events are the most important events, and in fact they should be recorded, and that's the reason because of what they were mostly focused like they remain focused on the this part. So after this ancient times, when you reach to the medieval times, that the notion of history started changing. And in fact, like there are two basic things that you should keep in mind here. One is the like Roman history, and the second was the Islamic history, right? So these two worlds were there, which had been contributing for defining the history. And when it comes to like their contribution, so like I can take the name of few fellows, but here I would like to take the name of two fellows which are very important. That's called as Al-Tabari and Ibn Khaldun, right? These are two medieval scholars. They were called as, one I told you, Ibn Khaldun, right? He was from, basically he was an Arab scholar, right? And then it comes to Al-Tabari. Al Al-Tabari. Now, why am I referring about these two fellows? I'm referring for a reason, because when it comes to these two scholars, they have defined that what is history. So they have simply said the rise and fall of the dynasties is the core context of history. But then further, Ibn Khaldun was that person who also admitted that actually, like he was the person who was first to theorize the society. It means that whatsoever developments you see in the history, now they can be also studied with respect to certain theories. This is what I like refer as models, because if you believe that also develop all like all whatsoever developments were happening in the past, they had no connection, basically they do not have any connection, or they are like very much free from each other, that is incorrect. So when you see the developments like in various corners of when you see the developments in various corners of world, frankly speaking, like same sort of process is being followed by them. And why is this like same sort of process being followed by them? Because that's again very simple, because like it is a common phenomena that whenever the societies are grooming, like they have been following certain sort of like similar pattern. So if we'll see, acha, one more thing, if we'll see this medieval historiography specifically with respect to Roman and the Islamic history, they had greater influence of religion also, right? So whenever it comes to the interpretation, frankly speaking, in the interpretation what happened, the religion was dominating. That also I should tell you that how come this religion is dominating, because that again should be understood in the context of like Indian history also, context of uh, Indian history. Okay, fine. Such as such as uh, when it comes to like the coming of Muslims or the Turks into India. At that point of time, what happens? Like the majority of the people uh, have written the history. Like so, a good number of people have written the history of that particular time. And when you talk about that history, like it was always being interpreted in the religious line. So let's say Babur entered into India, and then like this is being written by any contemporary scholar. In that case, like that event is being given more preference, And as far as the interpretation is concerned, that was never given that much preference by them, and they simply said, it was the wish of Allah because of what Babur somehow managed to defeat the Rajput rulers, or else let's say Lodhis, and that's how he's coming to power. So religion had a greater influence in the history writing at that point of time, and it was like somehow making the history very unfortunate, because this is not the kind of history that we study in the present time. Okay, so ancient and medieval interpretation remain the same, but then that is not very important for us. What is important, that whatsoever further changes were coming. Now among the further changes, I can say 15th to 18th century is a very important, 18th century is a very important, timeline in which history had started evolving in a very different manner. Now history has started evolving in a very different manner, and here onwards the kind of history, which started happening, that history becomes very important for us. And in fact, here onwards we are going to discuss about 19th century and then 20th century, and then I'll discuss about 21st century also, the kind of changes coming into the history. But then in order to understand the history in 20th century and 21st century, it is very important for us that you understand how come that whole perception of history is changing. So the way I had been discussing, when it comes to the ancient and medieval perception for the history, like only the dynasties were very important, or some political events were very important, and that's how they had been given more emphasis while writing the history. So either you say the history written in the ancient times, and in fact even the history which was there in the Puranas, or let's say in Itihasas, or even Kalhana's Raj Tarangani, why are they giving greater emphasis on the political history? Now, while writing the answer of this question, as I told you, that you have to write that the perception of history used to be very different at that point of time. That's how history was like this. So basically this perception is changing precisely in which particular period? It is changing in between 15th to 18th century, fine. Now what is the reason, right? What is the main reason because of what it is changing? So first of all, I would like to say about Renaissance. Renaissance, right? The Renaissance is one of the primary reasons because of what ultimately the perception of history is changing. Now Renaissance as is a, it's a movement, no, which was focusing a lot on humanism, fine. So earlier what happened, the institutions were more important, right? Either you say the political institutions, or let's say religious institutions, or even in the social, in the society, you can talk about the social institutions. Again, I have been repeating this point. So in the ancient and medieval times, with respect to the world, or let's say Europe, the institutions were more important, right? So if you talk about state, it was an institution, and in fact the history of the common man is not very important, or the human being is not very important. What is important? The history of institution. Now there is a basic shift from the institutional history, right? So earlier what sort of history is there? Institution. Now we can say ki human being became more important. From there, there's a larger shift, and this particular shift really very important, right? So just take it very seriously. And in fact, if we'll talk about if we'll talk about the important people, those who contributed at that point of time, so there, I can take the name of one very important, fellow, that's called as Machiavelli, right? So Machiavelli, who is one scholar who had been contributing for the new definition of history. He said, whoever wishes to foresee the future must consult the past. Now, look at this perception. Now, whenever we have been trying to justify, okay, we talk about history in the present context, we always used to say that history is very important. In fact, if you have been reading NCERT also, in the beginning only it is being written, in order to understand the future and the present, it is very important that you understand the past. Now, this is the statement which is coming for the first time by Machiavelli, and he says that actually, if you need to understand, or if you need to see the future, for that you need to understand the past, right? So that is how a connection is being made between past, between past, present, and फ्यूचर. अगर आपको प्रेजेंट को समझना है बहुत बेहतर तरीके से, ठीक है, या फिर आपको फ्यूचर को फोर्सी करना है, इफ यू हैव टू somehow go for some sort of anticipation of the future, frankly speaking, that is the right way of doing it. That is what he's saying. So that's how, for Machiavelli, this becomes very important, right? It becomes very important, and that is how history emerges as one of the necessary disciplines, right? It becomes one of the necessary discipline in order to understand the present day society, right? That is how he makes it very important. There was another person that he is also contributing a lot in this, that's called as Voltaire. I believe that you might have heard, like at least you must have heard the passing references of these things. So आपने इसके बारे में शायद सुना होगा. Voltaire का contribution क्या है? He is writing somewhere in the 18th century. Machiavelli 16th century में लिखते हैं, and then he is writing in the 18th century. Now Voltaire writes कि history is a basically narration of events, right? With respect to their causes and the consequences. So he says that history is basically a sort of narration of events, right? But then what he like do these two important terms which have been highlighted by them, that it is very important with respect to what the causes and the consequences. Now these two terms, like we even give proper weightage to these two terms, and we always say that as far as history is concerned, we should always try to see it in the in terms of the causes and consequences. But at the same time, I would like to say this to you as well, right? Ki this is a definition of history which was coming somewhere in 18th century. Like this is so unfortunate, but then many of us are yet trapped in the same understanding of history, and that's how we always see the things of history in terms of causes and the consequences, right? First world war हो गया, लेकिन first world war में क्या important changes हुए, so we simply talk about okay, these are some important reasons for the first world war, and then these were the important consequences of the first world war. So somehow we follow this approach, which is not a right approach towards the subject, right? And it is a very old pattern that we have been following in the present time, right? So if it comes to the development between 15th to 18th century, now we can say that the history is changing to a certain extent. And in fact, in the later period, the way we are going to discuss about the way we are going to discuss about history, the way it is evolving a sort of scientific subject rather than a sort of pure subject of humanity which could be dealt in any way and anybody could write anything, that perception is ending. So that's how the Renaissance and the scholars coming between 16th to 18th century, they have played very important role, right? And that's how in 19th century ultimately some of the major changes are happening in the understanding of history. Now here onwards you need to be a bit attentive, right? 19th century, because in 19th century some of the great scholars are coming, and in fact they had been defining history in their own way, and it is a very unique and let's say innovative way of defining history. That's the reason I have been telling you that you have to keep it you have to somehow understand it in a better way. Fine. So that history which is coming after 19th century, this has been called as scientific history also, right? That has been called as like that has been called as scientific history. Scientific history. And here onwards, there are multiple debates which are coming up, right? I'm not getting into those debates because, frankly speaking, you become the master of those debates. That is not very important. But then you understand how come how come history as a discipline is evolving, and what sort of history that you have been studying, what kind of history it is, right? What kind of history it is. Is it a very old sort of history or a new sort of history? ये बात कई important है. तभी मैं कहता हूँ कि history is don't see it in terms of only points, because if you keep on seeing the history in terms of points, that you won't be able to do it somehow or you won't be able to somehow cover the syllabus in a pretty good manner. समझिए इस subject को, बहुत कुछ है. There are so many things to be understood here. That is what you have to keep in mind. Okay, so yeah. So when it comes to 19th century, the way I had been telling you that it is here it is emerging somehow as a as a scientific history. Okay. So then we can say some of the scholars are coming in even here also, and in fact among them one I had been already discussing, that was scholars ranking. Okay. There are several debates in history that whether history is science or not, or else whether history can become an objective subject or not. Because normally what happens when it comes to the humanities paper, we believe that they are humanities. Why? Because there cannot be a fixed interpretation, and then most importantly empiricism is one point which is making it different from the sciences. But then this is the period which is known as the 20th century, 19th century. In 19th century, there are several scholars are coming, and in fact, they were quite adamant to prove this idea. That no, history is also like a science or like the science subject, And in fact, yes, it is possible for historians to write a very objective history, and that's how they started comparing it with the sciences. So जब आप historiography पढ़ते हैं, मतलब not in our like content, हम हमें इसकी जरूरत नहीं है, लेकिन जब आप historiography पढ़ते हैं तब एक बड़ा important debate होता है कि can we call history as a science, or can we write in objective history, or the subjectivity is somehow is there in the core of it, right? Somehow it is there in the core. That is like somehow like that is a sort of debate which is coming up in this particular period. I had been already discussing about Ranke, right? And I told you that Ranke believed that it is quite possible that history can be written in the same way or the way it has happened in the past. So I told you that it is somehow presenting a mirror of the past. That is what sorry. Yeah, that is how it has been presented. So Ranke simply says that history can be written in a very scientific way, or it is the mirror of the past. Mirror of the past. It means it means since it can be it is a direct reflection of the past, or it is creating a mirror image of the past. Now these people, the way they believe that history, since it acts or behaves like a science, that is why they had started presenting certain models in history. Understand this point very carefully. What did I tell you? That it is a model. The way in sciences what happened, ultimately you understand everything with respect to certain theorem और certain principles. आपके पास कुछ formulas, sorry not formulas, कुछ principles होते हैं, कुछ theorems होते हैं, ठीक है, और आप उसके basis पे maths या sciences को समझने की कोशिश करते हैं. So basically in those subjects there are two aspects. One is theoretical aspect and next one is the practical aspect. The problem is this, sorry, the beauty is this, okay, these fundamentals of the sciences never change, and that's how the way they had been comparing the history with basically sciences. They also started creating some of the models, and they said ki ultimately if you follow these models or let's say certain theories, in that case you will be able to understand each sort of developments which were happening in the past. Let's say if you talk about certain specific development in the society, now there of course there are certain patterns that can be noticed. I'm not refusing it. In fact, personally, if you ask to me that what is your personal belief, I believe that yes, to make the history based on certain models, certain models and certain, I can say, certain principles, that is good for you. It helps you to understand such as, and in fact, you can say how come it is possible that people in different regions are evolving in the same fashion. Yes, this possibility is there, because if we'll see the evolution of the societies in the, let's say, ancient times, right? Ancient times, in that case you'll find that they started with the prehistoric times, then they started using all of the development in Paleolithic, in way Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. Now that is true for everywhere. If it is happening in the same way, it means ki there is some sort of some sort of similar processes being followed by everyone. And in fact, here after that also you find that after that they have started using copper. From after copper they reach to bronze stage. After bronze they are reaching to the iron stage, and then after iron stage you find certain developments have started happening. So I'm not saying it is always applicable and everywhere it is true, that I'm not claiming, right? Because I'm not such a great scholar of great scholar of the subject that I can make such kind of claim. That's why I have been taking the references of these people, and I'm trying to make you understand how the history is being presented as a sciences by them. So they are simply saying there are certain model and theories are there. So whatsoever developments you talk about, and in fact these kind of models could be even made very much fit into the study of the modern times also. Let's say when you talk about the political movements, right? So when you talk about the political movements, when you talk about the process of industrialization or many other things, when you talk about the the freedom struggles in multiple places, frankly speaking, they can be also based on certain models. And in fact, as far as this topic is concerned, colonization and decolonization, basically it's being studied on the basis of certain models. That's how it is being studied. That is why I'm saying actually this might be true for certain extent, right? To a certain extent, I cannot say always it is true. So what Ranke is saying, yes, it is the mirror of the past, and that's how they have started developing certain theories and certain models. And the moment it comes to this perception among the scholars of developing certain models, right, for the development of or for understanding of the subject that's called as history, I can say some further greater changes are happening. And among these changes, there is one great scholar, he has contributed majorly here, and that person is called as Hegel. Now his understanding is really very impressive, and frankly speaking, you can take certain lessons from it. Okay, so what does he say? So first of all, he believes that what kind of subject it is. So he first of all believes that it is a very rational kind of subject, right? Rational subject. It is a very what sort of subject? Like history is basically a very rational kind of subject. And the way I had been telling you that, like, the way certain models and all are there, he is also convinced with this. And in fact, he used this one word, and his method of historical development is basically dialectical, right? That is the idea he has been giving, right? So what idea he's saying, or what idea he's giving? In fact, the term itself, I'll write that the idea of idea, right, was very important for him. And he believes that what is history all about? So he says couple of words, that history is all about changes coming into the society, right? Mind you, this word this word is very important. So he says that what is history? History is all about couple of changes, right? But then he also writes how come these changes are happening in the society, or how, what are the basic, factors which are leading to these changes. So we are somehow reaching closer to the modern definition of history. So what does he say? The changes are very important, and what is, the real reason, and how does it happen? So for that, he gives a sort of theory that says that actually there are certain theses, then there are certain antithesis, and then you find synthesis. मुझे बहुत एक्साइट करती है थ्योरी, आपको करे या ना करे दैट डिपेंड्स ऑन यू, राइट? So, being a student of history, it excites me. Now, such a creative and constructive idea he is giving, that actually how come the society, how come the society goes for the changes? This is the way. Now, what is this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis? Normally, when you go for the papers like research methodology and all, you talk about it. But मैं आपको थोड़ी बात समझाना चाहता हूँ, थोड़ी थोड़े थोड़े ध्यान से समझिएगा इसको. Now, what is thesis? For him, what is thesis? According to him, there are certain ideas prevailing in the society. That's why I told you that the idea of idea has been, like an idea and idea has been given greater weightage by Hegel. तो वो कहते हैं कि society में क्या होता है? Always there are certain ideas, or there are certain preconceived notion, or certain dominant notions which are prevailing in the society. Fine. So these are the most dominant ideas or the notions which are prevailing in the society. But then, can it be correct to say, or can we say like this? Since there's so much dominating that the other ideas do not prevail in the society. Now, Hegel is not convinced with this idea. Hegel says, no, actually, whenever there are certain dominating ideas, in order to counter them, certain anti ideas are there. Certain anti ideas are there. If there is one idea which is like more or less dominating the world, there must be some ideas which are completely contrary to them or opposite to them. These kind of ideas are there. And in fact, a continuous dialogue goes on between the two. Dialogue, I think the better word would be the discourse goes on between the ideas and anti-ideas, or let's say the thesis and synthesis. वो कहते हैं कि इनके बीच में एक continuous dialogue चलता है, एक discourse जो है वो चलता है, and as a result, what happens? A new idea is being created. New ideas being created. Now, what happens and how does it happen that new idea itself becomes the most dominant idea? And in fact, against this idea, against certain new ideas are emerging which are opposite or the contrary. And that's how this is a continuous process which is going on in this society forever. Now, I don't know whether you could apply this particular idea in, whether you are in a condition to apply this idea in your understanding of history or not, right? So the way, first of all, I did tell you that this person is emphasizing on the idea of change. Okay? What exactly, being the student of the subject, on what you are supposed to focus on changes. So history should be understood with respect to the changes. So of course, the way I did tell you that earlier scholars have been saying, earlier scholars have said, actually we have to understand the causes and the consequences, it's getting into this direction. So basically he said how to understand it. So he said actually there are certain ideas, and in fact these ideas are being opposed by some other ideas, a regular discourse goes on between these two, and finally it settles somewhere as or with a new idea, and then further this new idea becomes the idea, and then again opposite idea, and this is a continuous process which is going on. So basically you can understand it with respect to the various institutions which are there in the society, right? तो सोसाइटी में क्या होता है कि बहुत सारे इंस्टीट्यूशंस होते हैं, और देयर यू कैन टॉक अबाउट द पॉलिटिकल इंस्टीट्यूशन, द इकोनॉमिक इंस्टीट्यूशंस, राइट, द सोशल इंस्टीट्यूशंस, like religious institutions, and every institution is ultimately being guided by certain certain ideas. But then if you believe that these ideas are acceptable by all, it is incorrect. So whenever you talk about any idea, let's say when it comes to the state formation, let's say for one example we can take it. So state, of course, since beginning the idea of state was not there. So certain changes have happened, like certain preconceived ideas were there, these ideas were opposed by some other ideas, and as a synthesis, what happens ultimately, the state formation you see. But then that doesn't become the final conclusion. Rather, it is a part of the process, and in fact, you see that several changes are coming into the political institution, and that is how, from starting, starting from the prehistoric times, where there is no such concept of state. Rather, there was a very kinship-based society used to be there. So, from this kinship-based society, if you have reached to basically what stage, where democracy is there, and in fact, this democracy is also very different from the original idea of democracy. So, if we have reached to there, what it is exactly the result of what? It is the result of this, right? So this is a process which is going on, and that can help us to understand the various changes, that can help us to locate the various changes which are happening in the past. That is the best way of understanding it. So for Hegel, history becomes history is the history should be understood with respect to a tool. And what is that tool? That tool is idea. So that is how Hegel is giving a sort of very new interpretation of the history in somewhere in 19th century. That is the contribution of Hegel, right? Then Hegel was followed by another great scholar, and that is all known to you. That is called as Karl Marx. Okay? So Hegel was followed by another great scholar, that's called as Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx was very much influenced by Hegel also, right? But then at the same time, he wanted to bring certain changes in Hegel's idea, because there are certain basic conflicts between the two. So Hegel is saying it was dialectic. The nature of it is dialectic. So he improved it, and he said it is basically the dialectic materialism. So what Hegel does, Hegel is emphasizing a lot on what ideas. Now this fellow is emphasizing a lot on what? He is emphasizing a lot on materialism, right? He is emphasizing a lot on materialism. So according to him, it is not the idea which is initiating the changes. Rather, it is basically rather it is basically the materialism which is which is changing everything, right? And there he comes up with the idea of the mode of production, mode of production, and then he talked about always the class society which is coming because of this mode of production, because there is one section of the society which controls the mode of production, the section of the society which controls the mode of production. Now this person is some the section of the society which is controlling it, somehow they are in the dominant position, and on the other hand the exploitation of rest of the sections is being done by the section, those who have been controlling the mode of production, right? So there is a continuous conflict goes on between the two, the section which is controlling it, the section which is oppressed, right? So either you say the prehistoric or the primitive communism, and after that the way you talk about the slave mode of production, the feudal mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, he talks about a continuous conflict between the two sections of the society. And in fact it is a material conflict. According to Hegel, what was what was it? It was an ideological conflict, it is a material conflict, right? So he simply says no, not the ideas, rather the materials are the most important thing, because of what the various sections of the society are coming into some sort of conflict. And this is how ultimately they facilitate a new change, right? Let's say, for sake of example, I'm giving you one thing. Let's say if you talk about the slave mode of production. So what happened? At one hand masters are there, on the other hand slaves are there. So when it comes to the master and slaves, undoubtedly there would be a very conflicting relation, or the nature would be very conflicting in the relation between the two. So what happens because of this perpetual conflict? Ultimately, the system change and the mode of production is changing, and then the society enter into a new mode of production. And what is it? It is the it is basically the slave, feudal mode of production. So this is how according to Marx, this becomes the major idea of history. And frankly speaking, this becomes so dominating that here onwards the history is being redefined, and it is history is being redefined. And in fact, now here onwards the history is being written in a very different way. So these were the changes which were there in 19th century, and then it comes to the 20th century, right? It comes to the 20th century. Now in 20th century also some of the great scholars are coming, and they had been defining the history in their own ways. Okay? So among them there was one person that I have already discussed, okay? And in fact, his contribution is undoubtedly greater. So it is E.H. Carr. Now he wrote this book, what is history, and it is itself based on basically. It was basically based on some of his lectures delivered by him in one of the universities. And as I have already told you, that E.H. Carr is simply saying that it is an unending dialogue between the past and the present. Now the core things that he has highlighted, that it is basically a continuous dialogue between what, past and present. At the same time, he talked about the sources and historians. Now he is giving a more practical example, a practical definition of history, that basically in past there are certain sources. And in fact, if you go for further further study of E.H. Carr, in that case you may find that he is elaborating it. So while having the lectures, will somehow talk more about it. Abhi hum nahi baat kar rahe uतना. So he says ki what is history? So it is basically not only a dialogue between past and the present, and he's saying, also saying it is a dialogue between the sources and the historians, right? Now why the history is a subject or is a discipline which is having the nature of changing? Because of these two. Because it is created by these two. The sources, it is being new sources are being discovered, they are being reinterpreted in new way, right? The sciences are helping in a better interpretation of these sources. At the same time, the historians are also changing. Why? Because the historians always reflect the time. Their background is very much deciding factor for the history writing, from which background they have been coming. So their background, the era in which they are there, everything combinedly even influence the historian also. And this is the reason because of what, historian, or let's say the E.H. Carr is saying, the history is basically a sort of dialogue between the sources and the historian. Now this is one of the most scientific ideas that we follow for history. And in fact, this is the reason because of what I must say, that E.H. Carr is one of the most most reliable person in order to understand history. जब आप हिस्ट्री में रिसर्च करते हैं, तो आपको सबसे पहली किताब जो पढ़ने के लिए दी जाती है, वो दैट इज द बुक ऑफ E.H. Carr, or let's say R.G. Collingwood. These are the scholars. And these, why these scholars are so important? The way I did tell you, that somehow they are in a condition to define the things in a pretty well manner, that what is history. Now I'm not getting into great definition of this. I just told you that what is the core of the history, which was explained by him, right? Then there is another scholar, that is also very important. He's again very important, and this person, that scholar is Arnold Toynbee. Okay. Arnold Toynbee is also contributing majorly in this, and I would like to just emphasize or highlight some of the things of it. Now, Arnold Toynbee says that what is history? He says ki it is basically a rise and fall of civilizations. Fall of civilizations. But while talking about this rise and fall of civilization, he talks about certain challenges. Now, certain challenges which can be defined as internal and external. So, whenever you talk about any society or any community, specifically civilization, so it might have certain internal challenges and some external challenges. And these internal and external challenges ultimately facilitate, right, the further changes coming into the communities. And that's how we should understand the history with respect to this, right? So we should not always focus on the external challenges, because that is the major contribution. Because what happens, we mostly focus on the external challenges, कोई war हो गया, कोई attack हो गया, कोई invasion हो गया. But then internal challenges are also very important, such as again, I'll give you one example. If we'll talk about, let's say, the fall of Mauryans, or let's say the coming of Kusanas, now that may be an external challenge. But then when you talk about the creation of caste, or the origin of caste, or the evolution of caste, now this is the result of basically certain internal challenges. So this is how Arnold Toynbee has defined, defined it in a very different way. Fine. Okay. Further, you find there's another great scholar, uh, another great scholar that's called as Mark Bloch. Okay, I'll end the 20th century with this only. Just a second. Sorry, Mark Bloch. Now, Mark Bloch, who was from, he was from basically France, and he contributed that again. It is a development happening in the 20th century, and Mark Bloch, who represented one school, and along with Henry Pirenne, basically, he represented one school that's called as Annals School, right? That is known as Annals School. Now, this school is having great impact on India in the current scenario. Though it was coming somewhere in the middle of 19th century middle of 20th century in Europe, but उनका impact Indian history में बहुत मिलता है. यही वजह है कि some historians like Romila Thapar and all, they claim to be not from Marxist school, rather uh, they claim to be from Enal school. Now, what is this Enal school? Somehow they believe in the concept of a what to say a total history, right? They believe in the concept of total history. Now we find that there are certain people they write the history in a very shorter way. There are some people they write the history in a very elaborated way. The only thing I can make you understand about this right now, there is one approach where you actually try to summarize the things, and you try to somehow fit everything in a certain model, and that's how you present to the audience, right? On the other hand, there's another school which believes that actually whatsoever the things present for the past, you present it in the same fashion and let the audience decide. Or let the audience conclude the things. So basically, it was a very new approach, right? Uh, it was a very new approach which was followed by them, and that has changed the history a lot, right? So this is also one very important change that can be noticed. And in 20th century only, there was another great scholar who is coming, that's called as Michael Foucault. Okay, that person was called as Michael Foucault. Yeah, Michael Foucault, right? So as far as Michael Foucault is concerned, this person has represented a different kind of history that is called as postmodernist history. Postmodernist history. Now, these two ideas, annals and the postmodernism, are two important ideas of history which have been controlling the direction of history in the modern day India. Fine. So this is how we can say कि there are some greater influences, and one more we can include. ले ही लेते हैं उनको भी हम यहीं पे. That is coming from, that is known as the subaltern school, right? So I told you Mark Bloch, Annals School of History, then Michael Foucault, that is postmodernist, school of history writing, and then it comes to the subaltern. So in context of India, you might have heard the name of Ranjit Guha, but in the world context or the European context, we talk about another great person that's called as Antonio Gramsci, right? So Antonio, he was from Italy, right? So Antonio Gramsci had started this, and they have simply talked about. I'm not getting into the whole sort of interpretation of Gramsci and then रणजीत गुहा छोड़ देते हैं, हम कोड समझने की कोशिश करते हैं. So what is the core of their idea? The core of their idea was simply this: that the moment it comes to the moment it comes to writing history, now this history is majorly focusing on the elite sections of the society, and greater percentage of Indian society has been basically they are being ignored in history writing. So that is how, why not to write the history of even these sections of the society? That brings the idea of subaltern school of history writing, right? These are three dominating school in the present context, and as a result, you can find that there are certain changes which are happening, frankly speaking, in last 3 decades. So the last 3 decades are very important in Indian history. Last 3 decades matlab from 1990s, from 1990s to, let's say, till date. So as I'm telling you that this is deciding the direction of history, direction of history and how it is doing. So if we'll see the recent history, in that case, you can find that it is uh, there is a decline of the meta narrative history. Like, listen it very carefully. Decline of meta narrative history, and in place of this we can find a different history is coming, that is called as plural history. Meta narrative matlab what, how to make you understand. Let's say when you consider India as a single unit and then you try to understand the history, that is a sort of meta narrative history, and from there you have been shifting to a plural history. Now this pluralism could be understood with respect to things. Either we can understand it with respect to regions, or else this could be understood with respect to the sections of society. If I'll break it down, in that case, I'll simply say there might be a regional history, right? Or the history of certain minor sections of the society. Fine. So that history, which was majorly written by some Marxist scholars like D.D. Kosambi, R.S. Sarma, right, Irfan Habib, and so on. Now there is a shift from there, and in fact, from there they have been shifting to a sort of new kind of thing. Fine. So this can be also said as, what is it? It is the impact of basically the subaltern school of history writing. If we'll understand the history of modern India, so you can simply notice that in the history of modern India, in the history of Indian, like modern India, you can find that now region specific questions are coming, right? जीएस में भी आपको ऐसे इम्पैक्ट्स दिखाई देते हैं कि रीजन स्पेसिफिक, इनफैक्ट तो जीएस के सिलेबस में उन्होंने बहुत कैटेगोरिकली लिख दिया है कि द हिस्ट्री ऑफ वेरियस रीजन्स and participants, from various parts of India. Why are they writing like this? Because they had been continuously asking you to read the history not only of Mahatma Gandhi but the other areas also, other people also. But then you kept on focusing on Mahatma Gandhi कि जय दे दी हमें आजादी बिना खड़क बिना ढाल, साबरमती के संत तूने कर दिया कमाल. तो जब आप यही गाना गाते रहे कि साबरमती के संत तूने कर दिया कमाल, तो उनको लगा कि ऐसे नहीं मानेंगे, तो उन्होंने बहुत कैटेगोरिकली आपको लिख के दिया कि नहीं भैया, आप दूसरे पार्टिसिपेंट्स के बारे में भी पढ़िए, दूसरे रीजन्स के भी बारे में पढ़िए. दैट इज हाउ दिस idea is coming. And in fact, to a certain extent, I can say that this might be a direct approach of the postmodernism. What I had been discussing with respect to basically Enard School and then Michael Foucault, or let's say Mark Bloch and Michael Foucault, जिस तरीके से they talked about Enard School and the postmodernism. What is postmodernism? Is basically the deconstruction, right? Deconstruction matlab you don't need to organize the things and then you need to present it to the person, right? Rather, why not to present this idea in a very unorganized manner and pass it to the audience and let them decide whatever they want to decide. And Indian जनता ऐसे भी बहुत 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 enlightened है, they can make the decisions. Okay, that jokes apart, ये joke था एक. So basically I hope you can understand if this is the reflection which is coming up. Fine. As a result, what happened, because of this only, there are certain scholars that they have been coming up and they started giving a sort of new approach to history writing. Of course, you have talked about Ranajit Guha, but then this is the school which is being represented by series of new scholars, such as you can talk about Partha Chatterjee, you can talk about Ashish Nandi, you can talk about Dipesh Chakravarti. There is a long list of such scholars who are yet very active, and they had been somehow writing the history in a very different way, in a very new way, in a very constructive way, I can say. And this history is very much reflecting in your paper also, right? So though I'll be doing this trend analysis in the next class, in tomorrow's class, well, I'll try to somehow link it with the paper, that how your paper is constructively changing and how this paper is expecting from you to become more constructive, from more diverse and come out from this traditional approach. Fine. This is the reason because of what we can say now. In the recent times, the Dalit history becomes very important, and when it comes to the scholars like Kancha Ilaiah is there, Sujata Gidla is there. Okay. These are certain new scholars. They had been writing the history of the Dalits, and it becomes very important. The feminist history or the gender history, that has become one of the core aspect of it. And when you see the questions coming on, the status of women, that too very frequently, this is nothing but the result of this history. So you might have heard the name of these scholars like Uma Chakravarti is there, Tanika Sarkar is there, Charu Gupta is there, right? So ये सारे वो scholars हैं जो precisely they have decided their line. मतलब they are known for being the feminist scholars, right? And in fact, not feminist scholar, rather I'll say the gender scholar, right? So they had been precisely writing about them, and so it has become one of the most important category for them, and that's how they had been writing about it. So this is how I can say ki, this is a very no, this is a very important and the constructive way of writing the history. So that is also a very important. And then most importantly, or the most important category here, I'll say that is about the that is about the revisionist scholars, right? So of course these scholars could be called could be kept in the category of the revisionist school. So how these scholars are being said? They are being said as the revisionist scholars. So it is not necessary that the revisionist scholars are always studying the regions and then regions and all these kind of things. They are studying even the older history, right? They are even reading the older history, but with a new perspective. New perspective. So they have been revisiting the older sort of history that had been written in India. So that revisiting of history is being called as the is being written by the revisionist historians. And as I have told you that there is a long list of such authors. And the way you know that in the recent times you might have come across these kind of facts that the NCERT books are being changed, and from the college curriculum there are certain new things which have been added. There are certain new things which have certain things have been removed. So the way you come up come up with these kind of things, that is simply the result of what? It is simply the result of the revisionist historians, right? So अगर आप पिछले 3 decades को देखेंगे तो उस पिछले 3 decades में बहुत सारे ऐसे कंस्ट्रक्टिव चेंजेस हैं इंडियन हिस्ट्री में, और 3 decade सफिशिएंट वक्त होता है in order to influence your curriculum, your paper, your evaluation of the paper and all these kind of things. And this is this is how I've been just trying to somehow put forward one idea, that you need to change your approach towards the subject, right? So what approach were we have been following, the way I did tell you, हो सकता है बहुत पुराना हो, 18th century का हो, 19th century का हो, but then the kind of history which is coming in the present time, that is more influenced by the recent developments in last 3 decades, and that's very important, right? So this is how I just emphasize on the understanding. And I must tell you one more thing, that our the way we are going to cover the history, that would be a sort of that would be under the impression of this, right? Or under the guidance of this, because this is how we'll be able to somehow develop a better better understanding of the subject. Fine. So that's all about the today's session. Fine. So tomorrow we'll be meeting once again, and what would be the objective for tomorrow? Now tomorrow I'll be going for the trend analysis of the paper, specifically from 2013 onwards. I believe that 2013 onwards there are certain substantial amount of changes in the paper, and in fact if you do not come out of this perception that history is nothing but the reflection of the history paper is nothing but the reflection of the PYQs, in that case most likely, I hope what I'm willing to say. That's how we are going to do. So that is all about the session. Thank you very much. So if you have any question, you can go ahead. You can ask it to me. Chat is live, I guess. I don't know. किसी ने लिखा है समझ नहीं आ रहा भाई, इसको सब इंग्लिश अंग्रेजी में पढ़ाते हैं। तो अंग्रेजी माध्यम का ये पता नहीं, एक नया ट्रेंड चल गया है आजकल, दिस इज अ न्यू ट्रेंड कि द बैचेस इन इंग्लिश मीडियम, बट देन द टीचर्स आर सपोज टू स्पीक प्रिसाइजली इन हिंदी। दो चार वर्ड इंग्लिश के वो बोल देंगे, ठीक है। आई थिंक देयर शुड बी अ क्लियर डिफरेंस बिटवीन द इंग्लिश मीडियम बैच एंड द हिंदी मीडियम बैच। देयर आर चॉइसेस अगर आप इंग्लिश मीडियम बैच से हैं, यू आर नॉट कैपेबल ऑफ कॉम्प्रिहेंडिंग दिस मच। मेरी इंग्लिश बहुत अच्छी नहीं, आई डोंट से दैट आई एम वेरी गुड इन इंग्लिश, मेरी हिंदी भी बहुत सिंपल हिंदी है, और मुझे नहीं लगता कि इस इंग्लिश की बात कर रहा हूँ, तो मुझे नहीं लगता है कि इस इंग्लिश को समझने में किसी को दिक्कत होनी चाहिए. आई स्पीक वेरी सिंपल इंग्लिश, राइट? So I hope you will be able to adjust with this. That's what I'll say. Hello everybody, those who have said like बीच से ज्वाइन करेंगे जितेंद्र तो नहीं समझ में आएगा, ठीक है? थोड़ा चीजों को समझिए. अच्छा, जितेंद्र यादव वाज एक्सपेक्टिंग हिंदी फ्रॉम माय साइड, ठीक है? हिंदी, it's an precisely English medium batch, so 90% things would be there in English medium only, frankly speaking. तो उसमें हम वी आर हेल्पलेस, ठीक है? थोड़ी बहुत हिंदी बातचीत होती है, जो भावनाएं हैं वो हिंदी में निकलते हैं, एक्सप्रेशंस, फीलिंग्स हिंदी में निकलती है, बिकॉज आई आल्सो कम फ्रॉम अ हिंदी बेल्ट ओनली, बट व्हेन इट कम्स टू द कंटेंट वी नीड टू बी स्टिक टू इंग्लिश ओनली, राइट? तो आई एम सो सॉरी जितेंद्र, आप मुझसे बात कर सकते हैं अगर आपको कुछ भी जानना है, समझना है, और आप नहीं समझ पाए, और अगर आपको लगता है कि यू वांट टू कनेक्ट विथ मी, आप मुझसे कनेक्ट करना चाहते हैं, आप ऑफिस के थ्रू कनेक्ट कर सकते हैं. आई एम ऑलवेज देयर, लाइक देयर इज नो प्रॉब्लम एट ऑल. आपका मीडियम जो भी हो, आप बिल्कुल यू आर वेलकम टू राइट द यूपीएससी विद हिंदी मीडियम. बट अगर आपको जो भी मैं हेल्प कर सकता हूँ, ठीक है, आई एम ऑलवेज रेडी. दैट्स नॉट ए प्रॉब्लम. यू कनेक्ट लाइक विथ मी थ्रू द ऑफिस. आई गेस दैट्स ऑल, लाइक और कोई क्वेश्चन नहीं है. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining this session. Definitely join tomorrow's session, because as I told you, I am going to do the trend analysis of the questions of at least last 12-13 years, right? तो वो important है, तो आप please join करें और थोड़ा समझने की कोशिश करिए, ठीक है? Thank you very much. Thank you all.